We'll keep talking about inequality. Returning to the US, we show a similar graph of income growth where the horizontal axis is the percentages of the distribution. That black line there is the period from 1946 to 1980, showing that income growth was quite even across most levels. The very richest actually got a little bit less. That changed, however, and later times growth has been much more uneven. The lowest groups actually saw a bit of a decline. Middle groups had no or only a little bit of growth. But the very richest, the 1%, the 1/10 of 1%, the 1/100th of 1%, even the 1,000th of 1%, those groups got enormous gains. Economic growth used to be widely shared, but that changed. The other table there shows the numbers of the 160 million households in the US. The top 10th, about 16 million households, had at least $740,000 in wealth, although the average was a little higher. The top 10% held over 77% of the wealth. The top 1%, 1.6 million households, had at least $4.4 million in wealth, an average of 15 million. To get the top 1/10 of 1%, a household needed $23 million. To get in the top 1/100th of 1% would take $120 million. There are about 16,000 such ultra-wealthy households, and they held over 11% of all the total wealth. This shows after-tax income growth for different groups of people. The top 100th of 1%, the average per capita GDP, the middle 40%, and the bottom 50%. Go back to where we started with this class, growth rates. You can do these calculations. The top 1/100th of 1% had income grow 420% over 40 years. That's 4.2% a year. Not bad. The next group grew 79% over 40 years. That's 1.5% per year. The next group increased 50% over the long period. That's 1% a year. Lowest group grew just 20% over 40 years. That's under 0.5% per year. As we've been seeing throughout this class, what sound like relatively small differences in steady growth rates can end up really big after 40 years. The difference between 4.2% a year and 1.5 a year maybe doesn't seem like a giant difference. But over 40 years, that translates into something like over 400% versus 80%. It's a reminder, the tools we've been using in this class remain really useful for understanding what's going on. The graph on the right shows median net worth for black and white households. We can see there's a huge gap. When we talk about inequality in the US, that includes inequality between black and white Americans. There's substantial inequality within each group as well. The other chart on the left shows inequality based on age. This summarizes with the statistics showing the probability that a person born in a particular year would go on to make more money than their parents. Among people born in 1940, over 90% made more than their parents. But among those born in 1980, only 50% made more than their parents. Young people do have it tougher. At the beginning of the class, we discussed that while GDP measures only certain things, it does correlate with a lot of other good outcomes. Generally, countries with a higher GDP have better health outcomes, higher life expectancy, greater happiness. If we look at measures of life expectancy, we see tremendous inequality in the US. Poorer people have shorter lifespans, and for people with lower income, that got worse in recent times. Not only do richer people live longer, but their lifespans have been improving even more. The two panels of the chart on the left show life expectancy for men and for women in different income groups. Men do tend to live shorter lives. We're more fragile than women. But income is also really important. That chart on the right shows health expenditures for different countries, along with life expectancy over time. You can see most countries increase spending on health, and got more life expectancy. Most of those lines move together up and to the right. But the line for the US really stands out. We spend a hell of a lot more on healthcare. We don't really get as much from it. Other countries have done a much better job spending money to improve people's lives. Digging further in the topic of why lifespans are decreasing for the poorest, we get into deaths of despair, dying from things like alcoholism or drug abuse or suicide or similar. People without a college degree are more than twice as likely to die that way compared with those who have a 4-year college degree or more education. People with lower education drink more and smoke more. They also report more regularly feeling in pain, which might suggest some of the rationale for why they're more likely to want to escape. It's a reminder that though measuring inequality of income is easy, we can find data on how much money people make. There are a lot of other outcomes that are more difficult to measure, but where the inequality might be even worse. Finally, consider how these inequalities persist over generations. Higher income people are more likely to be married. In the chart on the right, the yellow line at the top is a fraction of mothers who have a bachelor degree or more who are married. It's been going down from 1980 to 2020, but it's still over 85%. Compared with those with less education, where the rate has been going down farther and is lower. Kids raised by single parents face more challenges. Now, there have been recent changes in inequality. Since the pandemic, it seems to have inequality reduced a bit. Will that turn out to be just a blip on a longer trend? Or does that signal the end of a long trend? We will see.